Well, hello, everyone. It's exciting to be here with you all for our first webinar of the summer. My name is Kira Dickey, and I'm the Market Development Manager here at Perceptive. I'm excited to be your host today alongside my colleagues Jonathan Olshock and Sheena Gibson. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording along with all of the research and resources used today with all registrants. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today's webinar. We're going to cover all of the content in 30 minutes, but we'll stick around for further discussion at the end. Feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions, and Sheena will be monitoring the chat. We'll begin with some background on peer assessment. Over the past 2 decades, extensive research has shown that peer assessment can significantly enhance learning. Peer assessment promotes metacognitive skills like critical thinking, motivates higher levels of achievement, and provides valuable learning opportunities. With this background in mind, we're going to cover 2 recent research studies today. The first study was conducted by Dr. Chris Shun, who is the Chief Learning Scientist for Perceptive and is also a full-time faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Shun's research has consistently informed the creation and direction of Perceptive. The second is a literature review of many different peer assessment studies, which was conducted by Jianmei Yuan out of West Virginia University, and he's not affiliated with Perceptive. So now we'll jump into the first study from Dr. Shun, which is understanding the what and when of peer feedback benefits for performance and transfer. This study analyzed a large data set comprising of 505 assignments from multiple universities and courses using a web-based peer feedback system. The assignments varied in type and submission format, offering a comprehensive look at how peer feedback works across different contexts. The study aimed to answer 3 key research questions. First, they investigated what makes feedback effective for improving student performance, examining the length and helpfulness of both provided feedback and received feedback. Secondly, they looked at why the effects of feedback vary so much between different assignments and courses, analyzing the variability in effect size. Lastly, they explored how the similarity between consecutive assignments affects the impact of feedback, focusing on the transfer of knowledge between assignments. This diagram acts as a visual representation of the key findings of the study. I know this looks like a lot, but don't worry, you don't have to try to take this all in now or anything. We're going to go through it point by point. So the first key finding is that giving students providing feedback to their peers has a larger impact on learning outcomes than receiving feedback, which is demonstrated by the 2 thicker arrows here. And moreover, if you'll notice, students providing longer feedback was more closely linked to learning than the helpfulness of that feedback. They also found that the effectiveness of feedback varied more between different assignments rather than across different courses. And this variation is partially explained by the differences in knowledge transfer between assignments. So this basically means that the extent to which students can apply knowledge from one assignment to the next influences how effective the feedback is in promoting learning outcomes. And lastly, you may have already noticed this, but they found that students providing feedback to their peers consistently yielded positive effects on learning outcomes, even when the assignments were not very similar. And this finding aligns with the theoretical model of interactive, constructive, active, and passive learning. To summarize the findings, the study underscores the critical role that providing feedback to peers plays in enhancing student learning outcomes. Now we're going to shift our focus to our next research study, but first, let's look at some of the common challenges faced in implementing peer assessment that have been identified through research. These might feel familiar. We're actually going to run a little poll right now. You should see a poll on your screen now. So if you have facilitated peer review, what challenges have you faced? And feel free to use one of the challenges on the screen. Those are identified through research, so probably familiar to most of you. A few more seconds on our poll. Gina, can you close the poll now? Okay. Now that we've identified the challenges, let's explore how we can effectively navigate them with evidence-based guidelines. This brings us to the second study we'll discuss today, guidelines for preparing for, designing, and implementing peer assessment in online courses. This is a literature review, like I said earlier, that synthesizes findings from multiple peer learning studies to provide 3 key guidelines for preparation, design, and implementation. The first guideline, preparation, emphasizes the importance of preparing students for peer assessment. Effective training improves their ability to give constructive feedback and fosters a more positive attitude towards the process in general. Instructors should familiarize students with the evaluation criteria and encourage a growth mindset toward feedback. And we'll get into more of this later. Jonathan is actually going to be covering this more in depth. Next, let's talk about the second key guideline, designing effective peer assessment activities. This guideline is broken down into 3 key points, starting with group formation. The research is really clear that feedback from multiple peers is much more effective than feedback from a single peer or the instructor alone. So one approach is to create reviewing groups or reviewing circles, which would allow students to choose which peers to review. Allowing students to have more agency in who to review may increase their motivation to learn. But on the other side, another key design consideration emphasized in the research is the impact of anonymous assessment. So anonymity alleviates peer pressure, reducing biases that might arise from personal relationships or status differences among peers. This enables students to provide more honest and critical feedback. However, full anonymity can also lead to a lack of accountability or superficial engagement, which makes incentivizing high-quality reviews much more important. And Jonathan is going to talk about that later as well. And the last crucial design consideration we're going to highlight today is incorporating methods to encourage students to read and integrate the feedback they receive. So one strategy is to have students specify what types of feedback they need. This ensures that students receive the insights that are most relevant to their improvement. Another strategy is to require students to submit a reflection on how they plan to apply the feedback. Or instructors could require students to evaluate the feedback quality and respond constructively. Ultimately, the goal is to encourage a dialogue between reviewer and reviewee. Now we're going to talk about the third guideline, which is implementation. To maximize student learning and peer assessment, combine peer grading with peer comments. The research shows that having students rate peers' work as they provide comments leads to more detailed feedback while promoting critical thinking and self-efficacy. And of course, it's incredibly important to set clear expectations and procedures. A rubric designed specifically for peer assessment can significantly enhance the consistency and quality of peer feedback. And Jonathan will be discussing this also more in depth later and providing some practical examples. And leveraging technology can also be incredibly helpful in meeting these guidelines, especially in online environments. So to summarize, the essential research-based guidelines for peer assessment are preparing students for the process, designing effective activities, and implementing structure. Now I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to guide us through practical insights and examples for applying these research findings. So Jonathan, I'll stop my share and you can start.
Thanks, Gira, and welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone who's in the room. We really appreciate you stopping by to pick up some of these best practices around peer learning. As Kira mentioned, we are very responsive here at Peerceptive to research, and we are always trying to modify the platform to be as up to date as possible. And so two of those studies that Kira just mentioned are very recent. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit even broader. We're going to since Peerceptive has been developed over almost 20 years of research at this point, there is lots and lots in the literature about how to structure these things. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a broader look and offer 4 keys to success if you're looking to implement a peer assessment assignment with one of your instructors at your university or at your organization. Those 4 keys are planning for logistics, incentivization, rubric and prompt design, and leveraging technology. So we'll walk through each of those and we'll give some practical examples there as well. In terms of logistics, as you heard by the research, it can be a very complex process to manage manually. So you have to really think about ahead of time, how are we going to do certain activities? So the first thing that we learned is multi-peer review is more impactful than single peer review. Multi-peer review means that every student is giving and receiving more than one review. What we found is that 3 is the ideal number. After years of research, that's the best wheelhouse for peer review. And so thinking about how are you going to facilitate that? Who's going to review who? How am I going to get the papers to one another is a really important part of planning an activity like this. The second thing is to, again, speak to that anonymity. We have found that anonymity, especially in higher education, leads to more constructive commenting and accurate scoring when properly incentivized. So the key there is anonymity works really well as long as the students are incentivized to provide good reviews. A lot of times, de-anonymizing can add that social pressure, which sometimes leads to constructive criticism, but it also then makes the students feel a little bit anxious and not as willing to participate in the process. And the final logistics category to think about is timing, document exchange, and response. So how are you going to cue the students when it's time to submit their work, when it's time to complete reviews, when it's time to take a look at those reviews and give feedback to their reviewers? How are we going to manage that whole process? What tools are we going to need to do that? What is the timing on that? How long should we provide for the document exchange, the reviews, etc.? All right, the second thing that you should be thinking about in terms of incentivization is in terms of planning is incentivization. So how am I going to motivate my students to participate in this process in earnest? The first thing to think about is what is the assignment type here? I need to align my grading or scoring with the stakes of that assignment. So if it's the first assignment in the semester and the students are just doing a very informal back and forth exchange around a literature review or a discussion board type of activity, the grading should be appropriate to that. It should be a lower stakes grading assignment, etc. As you move throughout the semester and into those summative types of activities, the incentivization should be increased. And then which parts of the assignment will you incentivize? One of the things that we see in the research is that setting expectations for the quality and depth of the peer reviewing activity is extremely important. So the students must know, what do I need to do to be properly participating in this process? And knowing that helps them to achieve that goal. And the last thing that we see in terms of the research and how students are incentivized is when instructors are involved somehow in the process, you tend to see much better participation from the students. Now, that instructor engagement can take any number of levels. Some instructors are very hands-on and they're providing reviews alongside with the peers, or they may be selectively picking documents from a large class that they're reviewing. They also could just be monitoring the process and kind of checking in with students and seeing who has submitted, who has completed their reviews, and just kind of helping students along with the process. So having some instructor engagement there would be key, and talking with your instructors that you're supporting and asking them how they want to engage with this process will be really important for incentivization. All right, now we're going to get into the meat of rubric and prompt design. This is really crucial and should be well thought out as you think about how to adopt a peer assessment assignment. The first thing, and this is pretty universal across all of the research we see, is that rubrics should combine scoring with open-ended commenting prompts. So peer assessment with peer review open-ended commenting prompts. That combination has been shown to lead to the greatest learning outcomes on subsequent assignments. So what does that look like in practice? So typically, with your rubric-based scoring or quantitative prompts, you would structure it like this. How well does the thesis statement establish the argument? And then you give the students a number of performance levels that they can choose from. A commenting prompt is for qualitative feedback. You can see one on the right here. Explain why you decided to score the thesis statement that way. We see a number of different options from instructors. So there you can either lead with a commenting prompt and then follow it with a series of rating prompts that are associated with that. Some of our early research really pointed to the fact that leading with the commenting prompt is more effective for a better peer assessment process. But we've also seen instructors choose to do it in reverse. Have the rating prompt first and then have the students defend why they scored a document that way. The key here is that you want to pair the dimensions together. So the rating prompt should be paired with commenting prompts, and every skill should be assessed in both ways. All right, the next thing to think about with rubric and prompt design is that each rating prompt should focus on one specific dimension of student work. This is something that is really different when you think about student-facing rubrics versus expert-facing rubrics. Someone who's an instructor who has graded 1,000 papers knows the nuance of a particular rubric. That it doesn't have to be as precise. But when students are scoring it, we really want to be precise with what we're asking them to assess. So for example, on the left-hand side, we have a very focused rating prompt. How well does the thesis statement establish the argument? We're very specific here. We're asking the student, look at the thesis statement. Is it establishing an argument? And then we have our descriptors here. I'll get into those in the next section. On the right-hand side, we have a more broad rating prompt. This will lead to confusion. It'll lead to less accurate scoring. And it also doesn't help the provider of feedback to really understand the expectations as well. So in this case, we asked them to rate the quality of the introduction paragraph, obviously a much bigger bite of the apple to take out than just the thesis statement argumentation. What we've seen in the meta-analyses of results from peer assessment is that these types of broad prompts will have students giving a much more variable scoring, because it's more difficult to determine what if the thesis statement is excellent, but the hook isn't there, or the background information isn't available, but the other two parts are there. Where do I score that on the rubric? It puts students in a place where they're not sure. And so these very focused rating prompts are certainly where you want to lean towards. All right, the third aspect of rubric and prompt design is that the rating descriptor should include clear language that distinguishes the difference in the levels of performance. So let's take a look at an example of that. Distinguishable rating descriptors look like this. So when we're talking about 4, 3, 2, 1, we want to make it clear to the student to be able to choose which level of performance the peer review is doing. So for example, number 4 here, all significant results are described clearly in the text, versus number 3, where most significance. So this gives the students a very clear delineation between a 4 and a 3. On the right-hand side, we see one that's unclear. This will certainly lead to more confusion with students. Again, they're not onboarding the information as well, so they're not internalizing what the expectations are for this assignment. And one of those reasons is, what is excellent? excellent to the student A might be one thing, excellent to student B is another, and excellent to student C is another thing, and excellent to the instructor is again another level. So by clearly defining each of these descriptor levels, you'll have a much better quality peer assessment. The results will be more accurate, and students will have more learning as they're providing feedback. All right, one more aspect to think about in terms of rubric and prompt design, and that is scaffolding of commenting prompts. Now, before I move on, those of you who are customers who are joining us, you are more than welcome to always reach out to our support team. They are all excellent at helping with rubric design. They can sit down with yourself or instructors to help you take rubrics that you have and adjust them, or help you create rubrics from scratch. The entire instructional support team here, including Sheena, are all trained as instructional designers or educators, and so they can help with these sort of nuanced peer learning rubrics. So let's look at these commenting prompts though. So as Kira mentioned, training the students is a really important part of the process. And you can train the students in advance and give them some prompts in advance to help prepare them for the process. But you can also build scaffolds into the process itself that will train students as they provide the feedback to one another. So on the left-hand side here is a comment prompt with no scaffolding. It basically is very open-ended and just says comment on the quality of X, or provide feedback on the quality of Y. There's no help for the student in terms of how should I structure this, how long should it be, etc. On the right-hand side are two of the most common scaffolding techniques that we see deployed in peer assessment. The first would be a framework for the response. So this one says, explain two strengths of the introduction, outline a specific aspect of the introduction that could be improved. So as the student, I know my task is find two strengths, find one area where it can be improved, and write about that. Very clear structure. You're going to get a very consistent type of response from students with this prompt. The second type of scaffolding, often even more scaffolding, you could combine the two as well, provides an exemplar. So this is a really great way to give students a guidepost on how to provide a comment to one another. In this case, you can see here that you can build these right into your rubric. So when the students see the prompt, right below it, they see, here's what a strong comment might look like. And then they can use that to kind of work backwards and create their own comments based on that. All right, so that's the rubrics. We are going to move on to one last aspect, and that is leveraging technology, which we do here at Perceptive. So there's a few things to think about. There are lots of tools out there that are ad hoc and work on collaboration, but nothing really specifically designed for peer review or peer assessment, other than a handful of products like Perceptive. So you have to think about purpose-built solutions for peer review, peer assessment, like we are, versus ad hoc solutions, combining Google Docs or trying to work with the Canvas peer review tool or something like that. They're not specifically designed for this process, and they don't have the research best practices in mind. And so thinking about how comfortable am I and my instructor at pulling a couple things together to make it work versus engaging a technology that's specifically designed for this activity. Is it research oriented? Are there clear published studies that show the technology is deployed in a way that aligns with the research? Very important when you're thinking about bringing on any sort of learning technology. And then the third thing to think about, if you're using an LMS, what is the level of integration? Is it just a link that you can click to go to the solution? Is there single sign-on? Is there grade passback? How does it integrate with my roster and groups? So it's very important to think about these factors when deciding on a technology. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to show you how we handle a lot of this in Perceptive. So we're going to do a very quick overview of what a peer assessment assignment looks like. First of all, I want to talk about Canvas versus Perceptive. We're gonna send out this resource at the end of the webinar as well. But just so you know the difference between a tool that's designed for peer assessment and a tool that's designed to do a lot of other things, including peer review, you can see here just at a glance. Again, we'll send this so you can take a look in detail. But Canvas has a very limited functionality set in terms of peer review, which is probably one of the most popular LMSs, and many other LMSs are kind of in this same range. They might have a check mark here or there in a different spot. Peerceptive, though, is designed specifically for this process. So it has a lot more functionality. It helps to ease the burden on the instructor because it can be set up and it follows best practices and kind of does a lot of that research onboarding for the instructor. All right, so we're going to look at, this is Peerceptive. This is an assignment from the student side. So we're looking at a student view. This is a dashboard. So it acts as a graphic organizer for the student as they work through this multi-peer review process to help guide them on what's next, to help keep the deadlines in check and keep students moving at a certain pace, as well as facilitating the actual reviewing. So as you can see here, the default process in Peerceptive combines 3 stages. Submission, where the students can submit any type of file. They can submit a URL. They can even type text into the system. So depending on the assignment you're trying to peer review, it might be a video that the students create or a presentation that they're giving using a PowerPoint and Zoom. But it also could be your traditional writing assignment we see as well. So they can submit any type of file for peer review. The second stage is reviewing. This is where the students will review a number of their peers' work based on a rubric. And the third is feedback. So as Kira mentioned, finding ways to have the learners engage with the comments that they received is really important in the process. And that's what this feedback stage does. It also holds the reviewers accountable because during the feedback phase, the authors of the work will provide a score for how helpful they found the comments to be, and they can comment back to their reviewers and say what they found to be helpful and give some advice on how to be a better reviewer on subsequent drafts. I quickly want to show the reviewing screen. So this student has already submitted, and they are going to continue their first review that they've already opened up. On the left-hand side is the document that I'm reviewing. So this is my peers' work that they submitted. On the right-hand side are those prompts that we mentioned. So we combine commenting and rating prompts, just like the research dictates, to provide the most beneficial experience in terms of learning gains after the assignment. So this is a commenting prompt. This one is loosely scaffolded, I would say. There is some guidance about how to structure your comment, but it's not as explicit as maybe some of those other scaffolding. This would be for a course that has already done a round of peer review, or maybe it's a later in the student's journey, in their academic journey, kind of towards their junior or senior year. So the comments would go here. If a comment is associated with a particular spot in the document, they can also pin that comment so that when the author receives it, they know exactly which area of the document the reviewer was commenting on. The second type of prompt we see here is for rating. This is where I start to generate that quantitative information. Just like the research dictates, we have the prompt at the top and then very clear anchor descriptions for each level of performance. These prompts, we have pre-built prompts that are in our system that are designed for your typical assignments, short essays, literature reviews, lab reports, presentations. So those rubrics are available to just be dropped into an assignment, but they're also completely customizable. So if an instructor or an instructional designer like yourself would like to build out these rubrics on their own, they can do that right in the system. And again, our support team is here. They'll always meet with you on a Zoom call, or they can exchange emails to help you design those rubrics. The last thing I'd like to show, I'm going to stop acting as this student and jump into someone that has already completed the process so you can see the results. All right, so we'll act as Roderick here. So Roderick, as you see by the graphic organizer, he's completed all the steps in the process, and now it's time to view his results. So one of the other nice things about purpose-built peer review solutions is that it gives you a really good breakdown of the types of scoring and comments that the student did. And it can also generate, like our system can also generate valid and reliable grades. So on the right-hand side is a collection of all the comments that were received. Students can toggle those based on the prompt. This middle column shows the score on the average score that they received on each one of those rating prompts. Now in Peerceptive, we also adjust these for accuracy. So one of the we do a statistical analysis on all the peer reviewers, and if you are more accurate, you'll have a bigger impact on the scores of the people you reviewed. If you're less accurate, your scoring is devalued some. So it helps to provide these valid and reliable scores just from peer reviewing. If a student scores a little bit below the average on a certain area, so narrative purpose in this case, they can open up this rubric and they can look for cues in those descriptors to try to find how to level up and improve on the next draft. What we also do is provide resources that are attached to each one of these rating prompts. So if a student doesn't perform up to par in a certain area, narrative purpose in this case, they can have access to a link that will give them direct help on that skill as soon as they receive their results. We know many students aren't going to stop into office hours every day, so we want to provide this help to students when they need it, and that is as soon as they see their results. Now, these resources can be provided by the instructor. They can be a video of the instructor just giving some guidance on these areas. They could be a link back to your LMS or a worksheet. Lots of different options here. It can be any type of file or a URL that can be directed. If the student would have had 2 areas that they need improvement on, there would be multiple resources here as well. Last thing to mention are the grades. So Perceptive generates one overall score that can be made up of multiple components: the submission, the accuracy, the helpfulness, and the task. The submission grade is how well my document performed on the rubric. The other 3 are all reviewing side grades. So with back to that incentivization piece, it's really important to provide incentives for giving feedback. And that's what this does. Accuracy is generated on how accurate they scored their peers. Helpfulness is generated by how helpful their peers found their comments to be. And task is simply completion. Did you do all of the steps in the process of the peer review? So that's the grading. So it's 2:30. We wanted to keep the delivery of this material to 30 minutes so that folks had time to get back to their regularly scheduled day. If we do have questions in the Q&A section, we are certainly happy to stick around, and you can drop your questions there and we'll take some time to answer them.
Thank you again for coming, everyone. We really appreciate you taking time out of your summer to learn the latest research in peer learning.
And folks, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the Q&A section and we will stick around to answer those. If not, we'll be delivering all of this material, including the recording and all the resources, to your inbox at some point in the coming 24 hours.
Feel free to type questions in the chat as well as the Q&A.
All right. Well, it looks like no questions today. So if folks have any other questions that they'd like to reach out about, specifically about Perceptive, or any questions about the peer assessment research, feel free to use the email you see on your screen here. You can also reach out to support@perceptive.com, especially for those folks who are current customers. We're more than happy to meet with you and help with any of this design activity on peer review assignments.